So as I said, I'm bringing up buyer agency again for some of you who have joined the business since last February, or who still are a little confused about it. What I see is a lot of agents just assume they know everything about buyer agency and just start practicing it. And that seems to be the case more now than it was in the past. In the past, agents were reluctant to use it and didn't understand it. Now today, everybody uses it, but are reluctant to really understand it. So there's a lot of trips in buyer agency. And so it's something that I think is important to point out what those trips may be so that you are actually representing your client as opposed to working with a client as a customer. So we're going to talk about the differences of responsibilities and what you should be doing in buyer agency. It's a fiduciary relationship with a client, just like a listing contract is. It's very similar to a listing contract, and it agrees that an independent agent may act on behalf of his client in a purchase. You can either also do them as rental transactions too. But it's a fiduciary agreement where the buyer becomes the client of the agent's brokerage. And that's sort of a common misunderstanding. Agents think it's my buyer agency with my client. And it really is Keller Williams buyer agency with your client. So what that really means is that any agent in Keller Williams can also represent this client. Not just you, but you're the one on the name. So again, as I said, it's just like a listing contract. You do the same thing with protected buyers. You have protected properties, but we'll get into that. This is pretty comprehensive, and yet I try to do it as quickly as possible. So interrupt with questions if you have any. So these are the things. It is not an automatic assumption that you should practice buyer agency with everybody. And I try to remind agents this all the time. There are times when you don't want to have buyer agency with a buyer. And I have that in the slide, buyers who will not be loyal. And we can certainly start seeing some of those red flags when we start working with somebody. They're apt to pop into an open house or call a listing agent, or they have a friend who's a listing agent in the South Side or whatever. And you start getting these flags like they're not going to be loyal and they don't really get it. If the buyer is talking about, only working in a certain price range that isn't even going to work in that range, that area that they're wanting to buy in, things that you can't follow up on. They want to see everything everywhere. Those are not necessarily the people you want to sign on as a client, because the minute you do, you have to obey that client and do what they say. And those who have exaggerated expectations, those who think they know, I hate to meet anybody, but those who think they know everything about real estate and have never bought or sold a house, and they're telling you how to do your job. Some of these things you might want to put either a very short term on your buyer agency agreement or wait until they're ready to write an offer to do it. But why should you practice buyer agency? Most buyers think that you are representing them anyway. And so you need to make sure that they understand the added responsibilities. I've always considered working in buyer agency as a freedom. It's so much freer than what you have to sort of shut up and can't say if you're working with them as a customer. So it's a freedom to use your negotiating skills and real estate statistic information. I also believe that almost 80% of your value of why you're earning the commission you are is your skills in negotiating. And negotiating skills are very valuable. The more you learn and practice and hone those skills, the better you deserve a better commission. You build better relationships. Steph, you said?
No, I was just going to does tack onto that. When I'm going over buyer agency with a new client, for example, a new prospective client, for example, I always explain that it's counterintuitive to me to not work in a buyer agency capacity, not have the freedom to be able to give advice and give my opinion on the transaction. So
absolutely. And it goes to the next thing on here. Natural relationships that you have, like family and friends, first-time buyers. It's very difficult to work with a first-time buyer as a customer. They need so much assistance and so much, especially negotiating skills. So if you are listing a property and now the sellers of the property you're listing want to buy, that's an important time to have them as a client. And because they are a client in the listing, you want to represent them as a client in a sell. And relocation. There are a lot of relocation companies. If you work with them, they only want buyer agency. They refuse to let you work with one of their buyers as a customer. So make sure that you understand the depth of what your relationships are and whether or not you want to work with them. So, and you can go to the next, scroll down, I can't do it. And this is when you introduce it. Again, get to know them a little bit first. You can take them out and show them some houses as a pre-agency status. You're just showing them the house, unlocking the door, letting them go through, but you're not making any comments about value or price or analysis or anything like that. You're just showing the house, and you make it clear that that's all I'm doing right now is getting to know you, getting to know what your needs are, and but not yet negotiating for you. But what you should do when you first meet with somebody is explain what buyer agency is and explain that they have a choice. We can continue going and working with you as a customer. I'll always represent the listing side, but I can still share a lot of duties to you. Number one being confidentiality. So I'm not going to tell them everything you tell me, but I'm not going to be able to negotiate for you. You're going to have to set the terms, set the price, and I'll just write them down and deliver them. So make sure that you introduce that choice of being a customer or a client. And a little further on in this slides, I have a chart that I made up years ago, and I keep sort of updating it. But it's a nice slide that you can show to a potential client and show them the differences of working with you as a buyer's agent or working with you as a representative of the seller. But talk about the importance of negotiating. Say my real value is in negotiating. I'm going to get in the boxing ring with the listing agent, and we will negotiate the terms between the buyer and the seller. But as you know, that most good business relationships negotiating have agents, a sports figure, a movie star, anybody in a business situation, they need a agent, and that's what you're going to be to negotiate for them. They can sign the buyer agency agreement all the way up to the point when they're ready to make an offer. You can work with a sort of a customer relationship until they're ready to write an offer, and you say, okay, now we're going to negotiate. Now you can hire me as your negotiator, your buyer's agent, and this is when they sign it and date it. I keep trying to scroll myself. When you learned in pre-licensing classes about the duties to a customer and the duties to the client, they go over that over and over and over and over, and they should. It's also in your buyer agency agreement, the comparison of duties to a customer and a client. It's in your offer to purchase. It is a constant reminder, and you are really supposed to highlight these duties when a buyer is going to decide whether they want to work with you as a client or they want to work with you as a customer. So I'm going to quickly review these. They're very important. They really should be memorized. When you're working with a customer, your duties are to provide brokerage services fairly and honestly. And of course, we all take that to heart. Exercise reasonable skill and care, provide accurate information, disclose in writing any material adverse facts. That doesn't let you off the hook from doing that. So if you notice material adverse facts as a buyer representative, whether they are customer or client, you have to bring that up and put it in writing. You protect confidentiality. Confidentiality is very, very important duty in the state of Wisconsin working in real estate. And we really respect that that is highly noted in our duties. You have a duty to safeguard their trust funds. We have that pretty well organized. Present contracts in an objective and unbiased manner and disclose advantages and disadvantages of the proposal. But what you're doing working with a customer is you're actually taking what they want to do and presenting it to the listing agent as what they should accept. You're not having any kind of bias on the presentation or advantages or disadvantages. But if I'm going to work with you as a client, this is what I now add. I take the duties to a customer and then I add these following duties. Now I want to provide information, advice on real estate matters. My advice or my experience, my understanding in the real estate market is important to a client. I provide all material facts affecting the transaction, not just adverse ones. So there's a difference between material facts and material adverse facts. You as a buyer's agent are to provide all material facts, adverse or regular. Fulfill obligations and lawful requests that are within the scope of the agreement. Don't skip the pages that don't have boxes on them. You are responsible to make sure that the client that you're working with understands what those provisions are in the full every page of the offer to purchase, and make sure that you follow through with the obligations that are there. Again, the important one is to negotiate for the client, and the agent will not place their interests ahead of client's interests. And sometimes I hear that little red flag going off where the agent is starting to complain about what their commission's going to be or what the commission's not going to be. And you go, hold on, because our code of ethics, our duties as a client, we cannot place our interests, our payment, our commission, our schedule, our vacation time, whatever, ahead of the client's interests. So that can be taken very seriously. This is a graphic that when buyer agency was new to our market 1,000 years ago, this was probably the best visual picture. So in a buyer agency situation, and you picture the box as a boxing ring, and the agents for the seller is the listing agent, and the agent for the buyer is the buyer's agent. They are inside the boxing ring with gloves on, negotiating back and forth. And notice that the clients, the seller and the buyer, are outside of the ring. They're not boxing, they're observing. And this is the actual picture perfect of buyer agency working with listing agency. And the two agents are the ones negotiating for their clients. If you are in, if your buyer doesn't want buyer agency, wants to be a customer of yours, this is what that boxing ring looks like. The listing agent is still going to be inside the boxing ring, negotiating for the seller. But you, if you are not a buyer's agent, will be a sub-agent for the seller, and you will be outside the boxing ring too. And your buyer, your customer buyer, is going to be negotiating with the listing agent inside the boxing ring. And sometimes that's not very fair. So the fairness is the two agents boxing for the betterment of their clients. And those little pictures can be something that you can present to a prospective buyer when you're trying to explain the choices of buyer agency over customer. You want to make it clear that this is what's going on if I am representing you or if I'm not representing you. Now, this is probably the most ongoing, and Steph and I have covered this several times in many different ways, in the listing, in the offer to purchase, contract training, and all the other things. What do you mark on the boxes in a contract? So we will go over it again, and either one of us will go over it one-on-one with you at a phone call or a meeting or whatever, if you're still unsure about what multiple representation means. Multiple representation means you've got Keller Williams on both sides. And then in the offer and in the buyer agency agreement, there are 3 boxes and 3 choices that a client can make. So they can agree to be represented on both sides, buyer and seller, multiple representation. And then you can do it with designated agency, and that's box 1. And that just means if there are 2 and you may be the listing agent and the agent representing the buyer, it means that you can designate another Keller Williams agent to represent the buyer. Because if you are representing a buyer and you are representing a seller, that's called dual agency, and you cannot really represent either one of them. You have to be standing outside the boxing ring as well. So if you designate another Keller Williams agent, then you are choosing box 1. So you agree with multiple representation, Keller Williams, and if there's representation on both sides, let's get another agent in there to work with them. So you can go to the next one. I guess those slides are here for you. I mean, if you want a copy of these slides, they're in the YouTube contract training library. But if you want an actual copy of this presentation, let me know and I'll be happy to email you a PDF of it. So in box 2, that just says that the firm Keller Williams can represent me and the other party, but the firm must remain neutral. If you can't have designated agency, it means both agents have to be neutral, and they really just become almost like customers. If you mark box 3, it's saying if they're Keller Williams on both sides, the firm cannot represent either party in the same transaction. You might have to go to Shore West or some other company to get somebody to work with the buyer, because they are negating multiple representation. You don't want either client to mark that, because it becomes a situation that if you follow it, you're probably going to lose business. So, and dual agency, again, is when you have a buyer in a buyer agency and you have a listing and your buyer wants to write an offer on your listing. That's called multiple representation. And you're not using designated agency, you want to try and represent both the buyer and the seller. Well, if that's the case, you have to explain to both clients that I can't negotiate for either one of you. This is going to be, I have to be neutral. I'll take your ideas, I'll put them on paper, I'll hand them over there. I'll take your counter ideas and listen to them, put them on paper and hand them over there. But my mouth is shut and I can't really help either client. So that's real dual agency that's fraught with liabilities. And that's why I've been a manager since 2002. I have always said, avoid dual agency, please. So this is a chart that I made up, And again, if you want just this chart emailed to you, I could do that too. Is there a way for you to blow that up a little bit so we can see it? Oh, perfect. What I did in this chart, and it's a nice chart to hand to, again, a buyer who's deciding if they want to work with you as a client.
I got a Zoom meeting still going on.
You what?
I think someone's got to mute.
Okay. You'll notice the two columns as a sub-agent and as a buyer's agent.
I'm still
So,
on the Zoom meeting.
okay, that's Cordell.
Is it Cordell? Okay, hold on.
Yeah. Do you have a question, Cordell?
I think he was on the answering another phone call. I just
Okay.
muted him.
Obviously, as a sub-agent or a buyer's agent, you both can do that. You can arrange property showings. In either role, you can assist with financing. So if you're working with a customer, you can still help them get their financing. You can provide property data, and a lot of people are confused about that. You can go into MLS and give them the data on comparables and things like that. You just can't analyze it, evaluate it, control it in that sense. You can just provide it for them. You certainly can explain forms and agreement, whether you're working with a customer or working with a client. You can both monitor the closing. Even if you're working with someone as a customer, you can monitor the closing and do all of the niceties and bring the present. If you're working with somebody as a customer, make sure that you add the disclosure to customers form with your offer. You have to make it very clear to the listing agent that you are working as a sub-agent for them. You never share your buyer agency agreement with your offer. The other firm, if you're writing on another listing in another company, has no right to see your buyer agency agreement. They must see your disclosure to customer agreement. Okay, so that's making it very clear on the listing side who you are and who you're working for. You can, and a lot of people don't realize this, you can provide a CMA for a customer and a client. But it gets to the exclusive responsibilities. Provide access to the entire market, listed and sale by owner if an agreement. Write letters to the owners who might be interested in the sale. I want to say something about for sale by owners, if listed in the agreement. There's a place in the buyer agency agreement that says excluded properties. If you don't put anything on that line, that means that you have to research everything that's on the market in MLS and everything that's on the market as a for sale by owner. There are for sale by owner sites, there are for sale by owner ads in the newspaper still. And if you don't exclude them or modify them for sale by owners, your duty as a buyer's agent is to show them as many for sale by owners as you show them listed properties. And I have a recommendation for that because you don't want to do that. It's a huge job. What you can put on that line in line 17 is saying that you will only work with for sale by owners that were brought to your attention by your client. So if your client sees a for sale sign by owner or an ad by owner and they tell you about it, then you can work with that for sale by owner. Otherwise, all other for sale by owners are not part of the agreement. And if your buyer finds one and doesn't tell you about it, he can go buy it. But if you don't make that modification, you're looking up every single for sale by owner, and it's almost impossible. And that's what I talk about being a little bit of liabilities in there. The agreement that you're signing in this buyer agency agreement is really doing what your buyer is telling you to do. And you have to be able to make sure that those orders from your buyer are clear and specific. So that's one of the modifications about buyer agency about for sale by owners that I recommend. Another duty that you have is to promote and protect the buyer's best interests. Advise the buyer in terms of the offer. Make sure that you are explaining to your buyer what he's signing. Things like, should I leave off an inspection contingency? Explain what the pros and cons of that are. And especially, your goal is to protect your buyer, not to just write down what your buyer wants to do, but give him the full benefit of your experience and your information, your knowledge, when you're helping them write an offer. And as a customer, you can't do that. As a customer who says, I don't want to have an inspection contingency, you go, okay, no inspection contingency. You put that little waiver in there, but you still can't actually promote and protect them. Negotiating the best price and the terms for the buyer. Have negotiating strategies. Have plans on how you negotiate. There are lots of courses, lots of YouTube videos on negotiating. The more you refine that skill, the better real estate agent you're going to be, the more value you're going to have as a real estate agent. Your negotiating skills can be accentuated and improved, and you should be working on that all times. Know what the different techniques of negotiating are. There are about 4 standard techniques. But if you're going in there and just say, well, whatever you want, and I'll do whatever he wants, you're not fulfilling your true value as their agent. Point out reasons not to buy. You know, we're not going to be like some people personify real estate agents, that we want to sell them the most expensive property in the highest amount so that we can jump in our convertible and go on vacation after the closing. No, you must look at it of protection of your client. Is this may not be a good purchase for any reason. This could not be, you know, as far as comparables are concerned. Make sure that you do not even get close to the fringe of fair housing, or you'll lose your license. And you can lose more than your license. You can have an enormous fine. So don't consider this as reasons not to buy where fair housing is concerned or violating protective classes. But you can talk about price, you can talk about value, you can talk about long-term investment, you can talk about inclusions, exclusions, what they mean, but keep it out of fair housing violation. Explain the pros and cons of the appraisal contingency. Pros and cons of using an appraisal contingency. Really explain what right to cure is. I kind of get nervous when I hear an agent say, oh, I always give them right to cure, or I never give a seller right to cure. It shouldn't be approached that way. It should be approached as an individual offer to right, depending on the circumstances, depending on the property, depending on the listing agent and seller, on whether you give right to cure or not. Now, we were in a market, especially last spring and early summer, that was so competitive that we were always giving the seller right to cure because we were trying to give the seller every incentive to choose our offer. But I think it needs a little more critical thinking when you get to individual offers. Is this the best for your buyer? You want to protect your buyer, not necessarily protect the seller. Explain the pros and cons of, oh, I did that. Again, with the inspection, but financing contingencies. Make sure that you are in contact with your buyer's lender. Become familiar with that buyer's lender. Don't have an information or communication gap there, because both the lender and you are working together to protect the buyer, and you should know all the terms for that. If I go on with the appraisal contingency, right to cure, title issues, testing, financing contingencies, and the offer to purchase. Don't just assume your buyer knows it or understands understands it, make sure that you know that they understand. This is suggest the use of addendum O or addendum R to clarify offer to purchase. If you're working with a customer, you don't really have to bring all that up. You're just writing down what the buyer wants to put in his offer. But any additional help, any additional assistance, really you don't have to bring up at all. But if you were working with them as a client, you definitely have to bring it up. That's part of your responsibilities. And that's the way to look at this chart. These are responsibilities you must do if you are in buyer agency. And one important one, and I ask this question a lot when I'm talking to agents about a transaction they're in. Have you called the municipality about this property? Have you looked in the tax records? Have you looked at the assessments? Check with any issues that might be on that property, easements. The title company will do that just before closing, but that may be too late. You don't want to find out just before closing that there's actual fireway easement that goes right, to the right of the house. Make sure that you understand these things, and it is your duty to do so if you're working with a client. It's not easy being a buyer's agent. You have probably at least 80% more responsibilities to do. And this chart points it out. Follow through on all terms and duties. Of course, both customer and client get this. Keep buyer's position confidential. That's a duty to both the buyer, both the customer buyer and the client buyer. Are there any questions about that comparison chart or your duties before I go on? Okay, there's some questions in chat. Oh, definitely, I can. Okay, good. And so again, it gets back to make sure that you go over what the possibilities would be working as a buyer's agent when you first meet the person. Give them the choice, give them the information, but they don't have to sign it right then and there. They can sign it whenever they feel like they need your assistance more, or they're writing an offer and they need your assistance, especially to negotiate.
I noticed, sorry to interrupt. I noticed that zip form, if you send that over to the buyer, and after explaining buyer agency and giving them the option, it like expires after a certain amount of time. Is there any recommendations as to, like, should we just hold off on sending that over until they indicate that they want it? Or is it standard practice to kind of send it to them right away to review and decide to sign?
I would send it to them right away because they really need to know that they have this choice right away. I don't know that prop things expire in zip form, but if that's a situation, send them a PDF of it.
Mm-hmm.
Convert it to a PDF and send it so they can read it and study it and ask you questions about it. As I said, I've watched the development of buyer agency for a long time. When I first started selling real estate in '84, we were all breaking the law because we didn't know that there was a distinction between buyer agency and representing the seller. And so we actually gave them all the negotiation, all the things, even if they didn't matter what kind of a buyer they were, whether they were a customer or client. We called everybody our client. We didn't make a distinction whatsoever. And then we found out about this large lawsuit in Minnesota that brought up the actual law of representation and buyer agency. Illinois didn't catch on until at least 15 years after Wisconsin did. But it was a rude awakening for a lot of us when we saw this. And then it was a while before designated agent became added on to buyer agency. And that made things so much easier because we could designate within our own company if we had, a conflict. But as I watch this progression, my point is, like I said earlier, at first it was trying to get people to use buyer agency. They didn't understand it. They didn't want to do it. They wanted to continue selling real estate the way they'd always sold real estate, even if it was illegal. And it was hard to make that transfer into understanding buyer agency and using it. What I see now is almost everybody uses buyer agency. It's like an automatic. You start working with them, you either sign it up when you first meet them or when you're going to write an offer, but there's no understanding, or I shouldn't say no. There are some situations where there's no understanding. The agent either doesn't understand buyer agency enough, or the agent hasn't communicated to their new client what really is buyer agency. Where does buyer agency come down in procuring cause? Where does buyer agency come down in a lawsuit? All the different factors of the responsibilities of buyer agency should be understood by 100% of our agents. We should really know how to use it and what's in this agreement, because it's a pretty powerful agreement, just like a listing contract is. It's a fiduciary agreement, and that just means you're hiring somebody, or they are hiring somebody to be their agent. So I'm going to constantly want to help anybody who have questions about buyer agency, but it's sort of my bailiwick of getting agents not only to use buyer agency, but to use it correctly and communicate with their clients correctly. And as I started out, there's situations in some cases where you shouldn't use buyer agency. Don't use it in some situations.
Question on that, don't using it
Sure.
Portion. And I think, so some of the reasons why we want to present that option, I guess, when we're talking with a potential client, is to avoid implied agency. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
And
So
that's what Illinois did for a long time. I mean, Wisconsin came out with the agreement. We had the laws written. We've had the training for our agents. And Illinois, for probably a decade after that, continued to use assumed agency. They just thought, well, if I'm working with a buyer, I'm a buyer's agent. If I'm working with the seller, I'm a seller's agent. And it wasn't legal. I mean, there was nothing in writing, and assumed agency got into a lot of problems, especially Illinois buyers coming up to Wisconsin and not feeling they had to fill out a buyer agency agreement because, of course, I'm your agent. I mean, of course, you're my agent. You have to work for me. And I used to do a lot of relocation. That was the conversation I had to have carefully with a lot of people from out of state, because the conditions weren't always the same in their other state like they were in Wisconsin. But Wisconsin for a long time has taken this extremely seriously.
So if we don't want them to sign it because we don't want to be obligated in some of those fiduciary responsibilities, but we still would like to work with them in a customer capacity.
Right.
We do have the option to negotiate that with them, right? We don't have to send them to another agent. We can talk to them about that. They're not the ones who are going to make that complete decision, right?
Right. And that's why I added that slide in there, the duties to the client and the duties to the customer. Wisconsin also has the benefit of giving a lot of very sound responsibilities to a customer, especially confidentiality. Not all states have that. And you can explain, let's just get to know each other a little bit longer, understand how we work, what you need to know, and then maybe you can wait until we decide to write an offer, whether you want me to negotiate for you, or you understand what you want to write and you will continue to be a customer. But make sure that you really show them that there are a lot of very good duties that you owe a customer, a lot of integrity and a lot of professionalism.
Are we going to be like outside of our what was it, ethics of being a realtor. If we look at the potential for our commissions and use that as a determining factor in whether we would like a client or customer relationship. Because I do notice that some listings are offering higher commissions for a customer, a buyer customer rather than a buyer client type relationship. And I think code of ethics are always putting them above us. But in this
Well,
type of,
I don't think it's violating the code of ethics to
Okay.
say that you have an additional fee that you're worth. You know, it's just, this is what I'm going to do for you. And this commission, it's not a fee, it's a commission. This commission will be owed to me and Keller Williams because of the extra services that I provide. And Steph, maybe you can talk more about the buyer agency cost or fee or commission, whatever.
Well, I think the question more to Tammy, if I'm understanding correctly, is like when you're looking through like data sheets and looking and comparing sub-agent co-broke commissions versus buyer agency commissions. Is that what
Yeah.
you're?
yep, exactly.
That's interesting that you're commenting on that, because I don't think I've ever seen a difference in what the seller is willing to, or what the company, I'm sorry, is willing to co-broke at. So if you're running into that, I'd love to see an example of that. But yeah,
Sure.
I mean, I like to Joni's point, I don't think it's a violation, an ethics violation. But I think that's just so rare that the commission compensation would be drastically different from one another, that it would factor into your decision making on whether or not you want to be a buyer agent for them or not.
Well, I
So-
mean, I guess to Joan's point, if I wanted to write that buyer agency agreement with my commission price matching whatever the co-broke percentage would have been, I have that right to do that. It's just coming out of the buyer's pocket.
Right, yeah, so,
It's the same thing as if on a listing contract, you want to get 7%. You know, if you can get 7% on a listing contract, if you're a good negotiator and you can prove your value and your worth to a seller and say, I'm worth 7%. You know, people are always trying to discount commissions. You know, I'm worth more than that. I'm worth more than 6%. And this is why. And I know agents over the years and today who still get more than 6% because they can do. That's not violating the code of ethics. That's showing what you can earn and what you're worth.
Okay.
But yeah, like, but on that commission line, for example, like we typically are writing 2.4% or as stated in MLS. You know, you could leave the or as stated in MLS out of it and say if it is, 2.0% that the company is willing to compensate us, then Mr. Buyer, you are you would owe the difference between the 2.4 and 2.0, excuse me. Does that make sense? Or you can do an additional compensation, which some people are, I think coming more into practice is just adding those extra fees in the additional compensation lines. So.
Yep, that makes sense. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't violating any ethics. That's all.
Oh,
Yeah,
God.
there can be some weird kind of like, there's a fine line sometimes in those areas. So I just wanted to make sure.
Sure.
Right. Yeah, it's pretty blatant when somebody is called before the ethics board because they're putting their own interests above their client's interests. And a lot of times it's over what price the client is willing to pay. That the agent is probably trying to get them to pay more so their commission would be more. And if a buyer could prove that, or say the co-broke, the listing company got wind of that they chose another listing because they could get a higher commission, and they'd file a complaint and things like that. Those don't come up very often, but in my private conversations with agents over the years, I've heard agents say to me, well, I'm not getting paid what I'm worth, and I'm gonna, and that's where you go, wait a minute. I mean, don't go there, because I don't want to go one step further with this, because what you're saying is actually violating the code of ethics. You can't put what you want over what your clients want. And sometimes that has to be checked.
Mhm.
Any other questions? You
Thank
all
you for
feel
the-
comfortable with it?
I was just going to personally thank you for reminding us about the for sale by owners and making those exclusions in those lines.
Yeah, what line is that on the buyer agency agreement to exclude the for sale by owners?
It's on line 17 through 20. It's identifying any specific properties or limitations on the scope of this agreement. And
Any is
usually
that,
what's put down is that any exclude all for sale by owners except for ones that are brought to the attention by the buyer.
okay,
And you know that in the buyer agency agreement, what you put down for purchase price range, say you put down 150 to 210, and they buy something that's 215, that doesn't change the buyer agency agreement. That's only a suggested price range. It's not a binding term of that agreement. Same thing with the no, I think that's the only one. Used to be where they were looking, but I think that's off the contract now.
are
And
there,
the part about confidentiality and non-confidential information on line 151 in the buyer agency agreement, I've always skipped that. I mean, I figure if they have something that's confidential, why put it on paper? Why write it?
are there amendments to this agreement? Or,
Yes.
okay,
Somebody just called me last week and wanted to know how they would get out of a buyer agency agreement. I said, there's an amendment to the buyer agency agreement, and you terminate the term just like you do a listing term. You change the date from where it was supposed to go to like today's date. And that effectively terminates the buyer agency agreement. And a broker has to sign that. So you could DocuSign it to me and I'll sign it.
is there a prior conversation we need to have with you before we start writing that amendment up?
No, unless you're trying to decide whether you want to terminate or not, you can just
Okay.
bounce it off of us. But basically, if it's a done deal and you want to do it, that's how you do it.
Okay,
Any other changes in the buyer agency agreement too, obviously can be put on the buyer agency amendment.
okay. Any specifics that are recommended to use the amendment for?
Maybe adding if you want to make a change about excluded properties, or you want to make a change about commission, or you want to make a change about things that are binding in here. Say they decided they didn't want designated agency, but now they're in a situation where they need designated agency, then you
Okay.
do pull out the amendment and change that to the first box.
Okay,
Okay.
Or I
And
feel
it-
like what might be more typical in that regard would be if they have designated agency, which is what we, definitely want to promote to you guys that you are advising them on. Let's say you bring the buyer and the seller together. And I'm going to stop myself actually, because I don't want to talk about, we don't want to promote dual agency either. So I'm going to stop myself. So sorry.
I was gonna say it's gotta be very tempting though for many agents that have a listing and they do bring in their own buyer. you
Well,
know.
you can't, I mean, there are, yeah, so if, let's say you know, had a relationship with this buyer client, and then you have a listing opportunity that would fit their needs, and you know, they consent to representation without designated agency, and your seller consents to multiple representation without designated agency, and you become a neutral party in the transaction, that is allowable. We just don't like it. It's just
Well,
still,
mainly the clients don't like it. I mean, they
yeah, well,
signed up, you know, for you to represent them. You know, the buyer wanted representation. So if you sign up dual agency, neither the seller nor the buyer gets representation. It becomes just a paper handoff.
yeah,
And today, most people understand enough that they want representation. And the other thing about dual agency, you don't have to pay the designated agent the full selling side of the commission. You know, all that agent, that designated agent is going to do is just the negotiating part. You know, they're going to get the offer accepted and maybe some negotiating over appraisal or inspection, or maybe there are no negotiating elements after that. Depending on how much work that designated agent did, maybe they just wrote the offer and then you took over from then because there was no other responsibility you had to do. You know, it can be a flat fee that you pay them, or a percentage of the selling commission, or buyer side. It doesn't have to be the full buyer side commission to a designated agent. So you're not losing everything, but you're certainly having two more satisfied clients who are being represented than not.
It makes sense.
Yeah, I paid a designated agent one time, just dinner at a restaurant. Gift certificate. I bought my own house, and I used, because I didn't want to use, it didn't have anything to do with dual agency, but I used a designated agent to buy my own house. So I wasn't the principal and I could be represented by an agent. And all she did was draft the offer and I did everything else. And again, I just paid her a small fee for drafting the offer. But anytime you're in these situations, individual situations, please feel free to call us, because you know we can talk it through and talk it out on your specifics.
Thank
Okay,
you.
if you would like a copy of these charts or of this presentation, just send me your a text or an email and I'll send it back to you.
Thank you.
thank you, Joni.
Thank you, Steph.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming on.
It was
I'm going
awesome.
to talk a little bit about this at the team meeting tomorrow, just basically the charts. So I'm going to get it 2 times.
Oh, Cordell, you have a question?
No, I did that on accident. I didn't have a question. I was trying to get
You were just waving
the
at us.
slides. I wanted the slides sent to me. I meant to put my email in.
Okay, good, good. Thank you.
Okay. Bye, y'all. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right, thanks. Bye.